All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Genevieve Bennett with Forest Trends, and it's really good to have you all here, braving Zoom for probably the 18th time this week to think together about outlook and opportunities for trading and for watershed approaches and other non-point source incentives as we head into a new year. We have a terrific group of experts and human beings with us this morning. We've got Anna Wildeman, who's Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Water. We've got George Kelly, who's CEO and the founder of Bespoke Mitigation Partners. Timothy Mail, Executive Director of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. And Bobby Cochran, who's partner at the Willamette Partnership. And so a few logistics. I think you probably are all very familiar with this platform by now, but we're going to start with some comments from our speakers and then move on to Q&A in the back half of the hour. You'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a little Q&A box, and so feel free to drop questions in there as we go along and we'll circle back to them. There's also a chat feature if you have a comment that is not a question, I guess. I do want to flag that I think we're probably going to get pretty into the weeds quickly this morning in this webinar, and so we're assuming some baseline level of knowledge about trading and watershed approaches more broadly. As we get going, I will be dropping some suggested resources into the chat box for those of you who would like additional background. And if you have questions, feel free to get in touch with me or the panel. And just to start us off, Forest Trends has been looking at these mechanisms through our tracking and data collection for more than a decade now. I think that the appeal of these tools has always been that they let us search out the most cost-effective intervention, right, to deal with water quality issues in a given area. And in a lot of cases, I think what is wonderful to me is that they do that by rewarding good stewardship, right, by kind of increasing the incentives to restore or protect our watersheds. And I think that's a really powerful idea. To engage the larger community who all have a stake in clean water. There's kind of a broader buy-in and awareness building that you need to do to make these programs work that I think is important for a lot of reasons. And where you're driving money for watershed protection or restoration, you're also seeing benefits beyond water quality, right? You're seeing green spaces for your community, you're seeing wildlife habitat, you're seeing carbon values, you're seeing a lot of other values. And my sense is that actually for a lot of communities and utilities looking at these kinds of programs, that is just as, if not more important than the cost effectiveness argument. That being said, these are not always easy programs to get off the ground, and so I think it'll be really good this morning to kind of take stock together as we head into a new year to think about the direction where things are going. And so I'm going to kick this off with George Kelly. George has a long experience working in water quality and wetland mitigation, although, especially for a young man. And he, I think, is going to be in a great position to give us the historical perspective, right? What's worked well, what hasn't worked, and where trading and non-point source incentives are coming from and where they might be going. So George, if you're ready, take it away.
Yes, Jen, thank you for calling me a young man too. I had my first, I got a recent license and they said, what color is your hair? And I said, it's black. And they said, no, it's gray. And that blew me away. So at any rate, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jen and Tim, for hosting us in this panel. Thank you, Anna and Bobby, for being panelists on this. I've had about 20 some years of work in the water quality side of the equation. And I want to first thank Anna and Dave Ross for really trying to unleash the market opportunity for water quality. I think they've done a lot of work, some really thoughtful work in trying to unleash this. The question you have, of course, is it enough? And we know we're going to be visited by the ghost of the water quality past and present. And frankly, I do feel like Scrooge a little bit relative to water quality trading. We're talking about a scenario where over 70% of our lakes and reservoirs are impaired, 55% of our rivers and streams are impaired, 78% of our bays and estuaries are impaired. And we knew there's 74,000 TMDLs that have been issued. We need every tool in the toolbox, but we particularly need this tool, the water quality trading, to work. So let's talk a little bit about the history, and maybe I'll give you a few observations. And I know others on the panel may dig in a little bit more on some of the specifics, but historically, this idea of trading was around since 1996. EPA had a watershed and trading framework that they issued in 1996. They also issued the 2003 water quality trading policy, and then recently we had the February 2019 memo that Anna and Dave Ross were instrumental in issuing as well. There are 23 or so trading programs in about 14 states. From what we can see, that number can be quibbled with, but I'm giving you a sense based on some of the GAO reports. But a lot of what you're seeing is driven by policy, not regulation, not statute, and a lot of it's guidance as well. And so there are questions about the viability of policy and guidance relative to this issue. A couple big points before I kind of dig into some of the general observations of some of the programs. First and foremost, trading or the idea of a market-based approach doesn't work unless there are strict regulatory standards for the permit side of the equation. I'll give you an example. In Maryland, in 2001, I was part of the non-point source trading group for the Chesapeake Bay program in 2001. And at that time, there was a sense that it was going to be a tool that was going to be needed. But the key there was whether the TMDL was going to be issued. And in 2001, it was determined, no, rather than issuing a TMDL, we're going to make it voluntary. We're going to allow industry and everybody else to voluntarily come up with solutions. And we waited 10 years before a TMDL was issued. And during that 10-year period, nothing was done without the hammer, nothing without the TMDL. And so to me, the TMDL, the threat of the TMDL is a keystone issue that then drives all the permitting, that then drives all of the programs, and then the potential for market-based solutions. So to me, that's a key point. The other thing is when you look at programs, a lot of times people want to focus on the supply side of creating crediting. But the key in any of these markets is unleashing the demand. Who's going to be the buyers and why? And I mentioned earlier the big point, in my space, I've never had buyers that have been altruistic. They typically have to have a permit that's driving it as the basis for that, or some threat of permit. So let's look at a couple of other observations. Recently there are a couple states, Louisiana, Florida, Wisconsin, that have just issued nutrient trading guidance. Maryland did theirs in, I think, 2018. Idaho has had a draft program since 2016 that was never adopted. But when you start looking at many of these programs, and I've been intimately involved with either stakeholder groups or on the side of trying to promote projects, and there's really not a lot of activity under those new programs at all. And the question, and to me, this personifies how you look at a lot of the programs, and there are different reasons for programs not working. For example, in Maryland, there's a very rigorous baseline requirement for non-point sources, and there's the nutrient trading tool that's very fairly complex. It's not a simple scenario. In Florida, there's not a uniform currency, so there's no ability to trade if you don't have a conversion on the uniform currency. In Louisiana, it's a bare bones sketch of a trading program, but you don't have the numeric criteria in the permits that may drive the buying. There are lots of reasons, and it is a very complex dynamic. And I think it's important to kind of dig into that. But I think when you look at trading, I think one of the most important things is that perhaps that term is a little too narrow. And I think Anna and Dave really were right on this when they issued the 2019 memo to talk about market-based solutions. It's broader than trading. And when I look at the water quality approaches, we're talking about trading, offsets, performance-based contracts, and alternative compliance. Those are kind of the four realms that we're seeing activity, and they're all different. And so trading may be too limiting. Trading is a scenario where you got a cap and somebody is trading to meet those caps. I think the most robust programs that have been most successful have been the offset programs. And I look at Virginia and North Carolina on their offset programs for new development as some of the most robust programs around. Other big points here is that, when you think about the programs, there's been very, very limited activity with wastewater treatment plants buying from non-point sources. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. But one of the things that I've seen in the marketplace is that a lot of times trading or offsets or credits can be only a small portion of the solution for a wastewater treatment plant. And therefore, a lot of times they have to build the infrastructure, the gray infrastructure at any rate. So it can't be, it has not been the alternative solution. But I think we need to ask the hard questions relating to the point sources. The other thing is the ag community. And I've spent a lot of time with the ag community, in particular in the Chesapeake Bay, about trying to get them to embrace water quality trading. And there's been a very limited participation, indeed to the point where some of them didn't even want to be participants or eligible for some of the trading opportunities. And there are questions there on that side of the equation. Do they view it as a backdoor regulation? That if they achieve certain objectives by creating credits, is that then the standard that they're held to? And the concern there. But we have to work, those are two big items that if we could unleash, it could be big. We're seeing amazing application of water quality trading to stormwater in the MS4 context. We're seeing that trading or offsets work well for the idea of nutrients, and temperature is a potential. Perhaps it's harder to look at it in the context of bacteria and toxics, which is an evolving scenario for us. I want to come back to this notion of watershed-based crediting and approaches. And Tim may have some additional concepts on this, but we started that way. That's the framework, the general framework. And I think it's really important when you look at this, for example, in the Chesapeake Bay, to say we have a TMDL for the Chesapeake Bay. Shouldn't we allow any solution anywhere in that bay based on the science and the delivery benefits of a credit to provide a solution anywhere else in the bay? The idea is we're trying to deal with dissolved oxygen at the main stem of the bay at a certain point. Shouldn't all upstream crediting opportunities be available? Shouldn't we look at that broadly? Obviously, there's local water concerns, but I think those are addressed in a different context. And I think you could look at that for the Mississippi River, for the Ohio. We need to begin to look at those broader frameworks that drive decision-making. The other thing is, in the water quality side under Section 402 of the NPDES program, there's been a lot of debate about liability. And this could be an impediment to folks looking to go forward on programs. The idea of a liability transfer was a key and essential point in unleashing mitigation banking. And I think there are ways to address that, for example, through permit incorporation. from the credit providers to basically agree to be part of permits. But the idea that the seller should be liable for what they're producing is a good one to me. The idea that it shouldn't be put on the buyer to be liable on that side of the equation. The other thing that I think Anna and Dave raised was this notion of banking. People said you got to sell on an annual basis, when in fact we think that forward crediting can really unleash the opportunity. The idea of at least putting in a project and getting some of those credits, similar to mitigation bank, in advance before necessarily those credits are per se produced, to have a schedule that allows for recognition of forward crediting in some capacity. The final point is currency and metrics, and I raised this in relative to Florida. If you don't identify a metric and you don't, then you can't optimize the trading program. And so in Florida, for example, they have a trading program, but but under their basin management action plans, there is presumed compliance if you put practices in place that isn't tied to a metric like phosphorus or nitrogen. So the idea is, if that's the case and you're getting presumed compliance based on doing the practice, there's no ability to look at the trade in a way that looks to optimize the currency. And that's part of the problem. You haven't converted what your ultimate goal is. Is it phosphorus or nitrogen? And what are the best practices for those? And are the practices you put in those plans actually achieving those objectives? And I think Maryland was very good as an example of taking this idea in the MS4 context, looking at impervious acres and translating that to BMPs and credits, which were then allowing the private sector to maximize that approach. So, Jen, I'm going to close out. I just hope that I get visited by the ghost of the water quality trading future today. I'm looking forward to waking up as Scrooge, rejuvenated and transformed for this endeavor.
Great. I hope that for you too, George. I like the ghosts of water quality trading, past, present, and future. So, good segue. Next we have Anna Wildeman, who is, again, the Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the EPA Office of Water, where she is the lead on nutrient reduction strategy and manages their work on major rulemaking. And so, as George noted, we've had quite a lot of important actions on nutrient trading and watershed approaches coming out of her shop recently. And so I'd love to hand it to her next to talk about some of those.
Thanks, Jen. And George, of course, covered the watershed, so to speak. I'm not sure what there is left to talk about other than to maybe get into the weeds a little bit on some of the things that he raised. So just a little bit of background in case folks haven't heard me talk about this before. When I came on at EPA, one of the things I was assigned to do was to develop a national nutrient strategy and to help drive the development of environmental markets for the reduction of excess nutrients in waterways. And so for about the first year that I spent at EPA, I traveled around the country talking to folks, asking questions about, what are some approaches that have been successful specifically for nutrients, and then what have been some of the barriers preventing the development of functioning markets. And so I learned a lot, and I heard from a lot of different folks, but I started to hear a lot of the same things over and over again, a lot of the things that George talked about just now. And so, putting all of that together from a policy standpoint from inside EPA was a great opportunity for us. So one of the first things that we did was to get together with USDA, begin to build that bridge across the federal agencies, which is so important and I think often overlooked. So we started out with USDA, and Dave Ross and Bill Northey signed a letter joint letter that we sent to every environmental director across the country, inviting folks to come and talk to us about their nutrient concerns. What can we do to help? How can we be problem solving? What are the challenges you're facing? So that was sort of the first thing out of the gate. And I think it's a model of kind of how we think about where to go with this. And that is, you have to start with building relationships. You have to start sort of at ground zero. Who are your partners? How can you work together and solve problems? So that's where we started with this effort. You know, George and Jen mentioned the February 2019 trading memo. You know, I heard a lot about the barriers to trading, why it's not working. There's so much promise, there's so much opportunity, at least perceived opportunity. Why isn't it taken off? We've got this long history of wanting it to work and being supportive. So what we tried to do with the 2019 memo is to try to break open those areas where we were told are barriers, try to create a little bit more flexibility in those spaces where folks have felt frustration and an inability to move projects forward. So the memo, February 2019, it identifies 6 market-based approaches that EPA is supportive of and tries to create flexibility around them. I think some people really long to see a comprehensive guidance or a comprehensive set of recommendations from EPA. And that's not what this memo was. Was never going to be that. You know, EPA did that in 2003 with the trading memo, and then with the trading permit writer's guide in 2009, I think. And those are comprehensive recommendations for how to do water quality trading, but they didn't really move the ball in terms of getting programs on the ground. And so we really wanted to try to create more flexibility for those state and tribal policymakers on the ground and for stakeholders to see greater opportunity where perhaps they once saw requirements or pseudo requirements for different kinds of programs. And so, you know, we really wanted to emphasize that watershed scale trading is the most appropriate way to do it. I think that agencies often, you know, long been supportive of that, but there was some language in the 2003 policy suggesting that trading should occur on a stream segment, which can be very challenging to find buyers and sellers on a segment of a stream rather than, you know, across the watershed. So we wanted to emphasize, look bigger, you know, look as big as we can. You're going to find more market participants in a larger area. You know, adaptive management was another principle. We really need to see these programs begin to operate, and we can refine them as we go along. Banking, George mentioned, we think is really an important concept. We do it in all these other mediums with you know, airshed trading and habitat wildlife markets, and so why not in water? There's no real chemical reason why we can't bank in water, so let's build that into the programs. The baseline concepts, you heard George mention, huge barriers to entry into the marketplace depending on how the baseline is set. And so we really wanted to just break that open. You know, what are different ways to think about how to set a baseline that can be more welcoming and can begin to create revenue for these market participants earlier on in the process without, of course, sacrificing the water quality improvements, which is why we're all here. You know, we're promoting multi-use banks, generating multiple credit types from single projects. You know, George mentioned that we went a little broader in this memo because we wanted to talk about market-based approaches more broadly than just trading, and partly that's because trading has some baggage. And so does this idea of multi-use banks or creating multiple types of credits from a single project, often called credit stacking, a term which also comes with quite a bit of baggage. And so, but you know, it's not a term. The baggage doesn't eliminate the utility and the potential benefits that can come from promoting these more holistic projects that can drive credits for multiple different streams of income. And then finally in the memo, we highlighted a need to get a little bit creative with how we finance some of these projects. Where are we putting our money? We've spent billions and billions of dollars in our point source program for decades. And if we had made those kinds of investments in our non-point program, we'd probably be in a different place right now. But that's not how the regulatory structure was driving the use of those dollars. So those were the 6 principles that we really thought were aimed at addressing the biggest barriers that we heard about throughout, you know, the stakeholder engagement that we had done. And so since then, we've been trying to build content out around each of those principles to try to create more dialogue, more opportunity. We issued a Federal Register notice with a proposal for modifying the agency's definition and policy around baseline. I think that we issued that proposal last year. We've got, you know, a handful of comments on it. We've considered them. We're getting very close to doing something to finalize that action. And it's, you know, it's again intended to create additional opportunity, additional flexibility for policymakers to think about how baseline can be set, how baseline can be achieved, and also how credits can be generated at the same time as baseline is being achieved. We recently put out a paper, more of a technical paper, things to consider for setting the size of your watershed or trading area. You know, and I think it's going to be driven largely by your policy goals. What are you trying to accomplish with your trading program? How far can you reach? You know, what's the scientific data support for the size that you've selected? And, you know, working with models and things like that to show that water quality improvements are happening. I think that's a critical part of developing a successful program, is showing success. And finally, you know, last year we put together a series of webinars on financing opportunities. We did this in concert with USDA. The series of webinars culminated in a financing convening where we had, you know, 100 people in the room talking about different ways to finance non-point programs or projects in a trading or market-based framework. And then most recently, at the most recent Hypoxia Task Force meeting, we had our EPA point source, non-point source program present to those task force states ways that we can better use our traditional EPA funding to promote or support market-based approaches, including SRF dollars and 319 dollars. And you know, the punchline was $319 probably can be used to purchase credits, and SRF dollars can be and have been used to promote these market-based approaches. And so putting a little bit of creativity and innovation into how we think about those traditional programs, I think can yield some interesting results. And then the last thing I'll just touch on briefly is, you know, we started this, and I started my talk this morning with the outreach between EPA and USDA. Well, that only grew as we've been here, and we've developed strong relationships across, you know, the Department of Interior, Department of Energy, and others, and the Army Corps, for example. And those folks, Dave Ross and his counterparts at those agencies, have come together in what they call themselves the Water Subcabinet. They're subcabinet officials. They all have equities and money and resources and efforts going into water management, water quality, water quantity, water reuse, water modeling, monitoring, all of the above. And they get together on a monthly basis, and they have been for a couple of years. And just recently, the president issued an executive order to really formalize that relationship across those agencies and to continue driving some of that coordinated progress that we've seen and have had, we think, created real opportunities to make targeted improvements where there are problems. Bring it to the subcabinet. They're a problem-solving body. They are, positioned to direct resources and make policy decisions to promote coordinated water quality improvements. So the executive order is broad-reaching. It touches on our 2019 memo, directs, how should we continue to implement it? How can we continue to make progress with the hypoxia task force in the Mississippi River Basin, among other things. And so, we're working now to sort of build out those recommendations to submit to the CEQ as the EO directs. And so, again, creating more opportunities to shine a light on a path forward on a couple of these important areas that we've been working on. So I think with that, I'll stop talking. I think maybe I'm the ghost of trading present, maybe, I don't know. And then maybe we'll see what happens next.
All right, thank you, Anna. That was wonderful. There was a lot there that I think people are probably eager to jump into in the Q&A. But I do really appreciate this emphasis on thinking bigger and thinking more flexibly. I was chatting with Tim as we were waiting for folks to sign on to this webinar about, there not really being a cookie cutter trading model or a need for a set of strict guidance, but rather letting things, really be driven by the specific goals and the circumstances. And because I think that's how innovation happens, right? You have lots of experimentation. Of course, as Tim pointed out, the challenge is figuring out how to identify and scale that innovation. And
yeah,
so
absolutely. I'll just make one point. Yeah. I started out with describing how I was told to develop a national nutrient strategy. Well, we don't talk about it that way anymore because of exactly what you just said. It's got to be, driven by the community, the resources that are in need, that are available for use. And so that was a nice idea. I think, administrations in the past have tried to do national nutrient strategies. And I think what we did is we decided that what we need is the opposite. We need absolute local engagement from the bottom to drive it up to a more regional scale, I think at best, because there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all program to solve the nutrient problems or to promote trading and market-based approaches. So I appreciate that comment.
And so Tim Mill, Executive Director of EPIC, the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. What are your reflections hearing this, and what are you and your team thinking about as the ghosts of watershed approaches and trading future?
This is a really fantastic panel, and I'm just so enjoying the conversation, and I hope the audience is as well, because this work is so important. I want to first start with reflecting on some of the policy actions and initiatives really that Anna described, that EPA in particular has led on, but also the other agencies that Anna mentioned. One of the most important things for an administration to do is send early signals of what they think is important. The simplest answer or example I can give is when a senior person, a secretary, administrator, somebody like Anna starts a meeting, the first thing they turn to, the first example they ask someone to talk about is an example of X, right? Whatever that thing is. You're sending a signal about what you value. And so the set of policy actions, of guidance documents, of webinars, of outreach to state water quality administrators that you, Anna, have led, and Dave Ross and the rest of the team has really helped send a signal to all the people working at the state level, at the local level, in terms of this sort of watershed, based approach being important, and trading programs being important, and contributing to the 74,000 TMDLs and the 70-ish% of water bodies that are impaired that George brought up. In the 2019 memo, the EPA memo, the most important thing that I took away from that is keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate this stuff. And that's just sort of a fundamental lesson again and again that we have to keep remembering. Anna mentioned, George mentioned the idea of having a bigger watershed focus to programs. That was a key piece of that memo. And then it also talked about encouraging states to use banking, right? So the whole idea of banking is start doing something today and use it at some point in the future. And the whole time it sits there sort of unused, uncaptured in a trade, uncounted in a permit or a TMDL report, it's providing value, it's providing environmental value. So why wouldn't we want to bank activities as soon as possible? The other advantage of banking is it dramatically lowers environmental failure. So if you pay for an activity today that you think is going to produce 100 pounds of nitrogen, and it hasn't been brought into a permit context yet, if that project fails 2 or 3 years or 5 years later, it still hasn't been brought into a program, then it never gets brought into the program. And the program, the regulatory structure never pays for a failed outcome. I think, and Anna brought this up and brought up potentially some more output related to this baseline issue, but it's super hard. It's super hard to figure out what should the baseline be, especially around non-regulated, non-point sources like agriculture. And it comes up in some of the trading programs all the time. Maybe we can get at that in a little bit of the Q&A. The documents that talk about 319 financing for credit purchase, that's going to be super helpful. And the programs that I give an example of are legislation that passed one but not both houses of the Pennsylvania legislature before the COVID pandemic began, and then an existing program in Maryland, the Clean Water Commerce Finance Act that passed in 2017. Both of those are examples of the state trying to just procure water quality outcomes, not traded. Just the state has commitments to water quality under the Clean Water Act. They have to achieve a certain amount of reductions, and those two states coming up with approaches to try to just simply buy completed work. And the reason to me that that's so important, and the 319 financing could fit in there as well as the SRF piece, is that this stuff isn't experimental anymore. We've been spending billions of dollars on non-point source water quality work for a couple of decades. And so people know what they're doing. They know how to make improvements. That's not true across the board, but it's true in a big chunk of this space. And so instead of using grants, where there's very little accountability, using contracts to buy outcomes, using 319 money to buy those outcomes, where there's an approved or an accepted set of models that predict what's going to happen, I think that's the way to go in the future when it comes to these programs. So that those clarifying some of those financing opportunities are huge. And then my last point that I wanted to touch on that Anna mentioned as well is the executive order that came out just a month and a half ago roughly, that talks about the water subcabinet, and specifically in this area asks the water subcabinet to report back on what are the next steps. I think that report is technically due in February, but maybe we'll see it before then. But regardless, I hope that some or many or maybe all of the recommendations in that document for federal action and momentum in the space of watershed approaches and trading approaches continues. And some of those those implementation steps are things that the new administration picks up. Just briefly, some of the things, and I'll bring this up in the Q&A. But the sort of future of this work is, to me, about scale and flow, so faster transaction activity and building up these programs. So I think there's a real need for policy, not directive policy that prescribes, but just simply policy that talks about the need for states to establish currencies, to establish these models, to recognize models, often multiple models, that can be used to count what is going to come from a set of activities. States that have currencies, regions like the Chesapeake Bay that have currencies, can do a whole lot more work than places that haven't yet decided what an activity is worth. what a stream restoration will contribute or what a cover crop will contribute. The second is environmental justice. And I think there's ways to talk about trading approaches and market-based approaches as ones that deliver environmental justice outcomes. And the key part of that is recognizing that it's not always about the lowest cost. If we all value reducing environmental injustice, we should be willing to pay for it. And that means you can set up programs that say, we want to produce activities that generate water quality and reduce historic impacts in these areas. And we're looking for the best projects to do, both of those things. A little bit like the concept of stacking that Anna mentioned, right? Where what you're stacking is not two water quality outcomes, but maybe a water quality outcome and a community outcome. And if we're willing to pay for those things, and we should be willing to pay for those things, we can use trading, we can use market-based approaches to deliver, both of those outcomes efficiently and creatively and with innovation, as Jen mentioned. And the last thing I'll mention is just the concept of a 0 year. It's a little bit different than a baseline. And I don't know that 0 year is the right term for it, but every improvement that happens from, let's say, this point forward, 2020 forward, should in theory count. Anything that someone does voluntarily or not should be basically, we should be able to calculate the difference between its condition in one year and its improved condition 3 or 4 years later. And if we had that kind of concept more often in place in states, we're to say, in the future, we're going to have a trading program, we're going to facilitate more transactions, we're going to buy more outcomes, like the Maryland and Pennsylvania examples I gave. We will let you sell, trade, transact, or get credit for anything where you can document its condition, in 2021, and its condition in a later year. And the effect of that would be to stimulate a lot more activity and a lot more commitment to these measurement and modeling approaches that we see across the country that are especially taking shape in the agricultural sector. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll turn back to Jen and then to Bobby, and really excited to do Q&A.
Awesome, thank you, Tim. I definitely want to come back to this baseline issue, but we next and more
Jen,
importantly,
you're on mute somehow.
Am I?
Right, we lost sound, but Bobby, let's just turn it to you, maybe.
Actually, Tim, I think you just lost sound, my friend. I think we're good. Okay,
you can hear me. Tim cannot. All right, we can work with that. So we've got Bobby Cochran up now, who's leading the community resilience and innovation work being done at the Willamette Partnership, which is a really cool title. And I want to just flag, Willamette recently led the development with the National Network on Water Quality Trading on a report called Breaking Down Barriers, which is well worth a read. I'll add the link in the chat in a moment, but it really lays out an action agenda and a set of recommendations, at the federal level, state regulators, utilities, NGOs, funders, on how to really sort of tackle this demand side issue. How do you really scale? And so, Bobby, I wonder, if coming out of that document or all the other work that you guys have done over the years to kind of create the tools and the infrastructure for these market-based approaches and also make them really broadly accessible and replicable. Can you share some of your own thoughts on what we're hearing so far and what's sort of the twinkle in your eye for 2021?
Twinkle. That's exciting to talk about. Yeah, Jen, thanks. And everybody, it's just really, really nice to be here. First of all, there's a lot of spaces we could all be in. This one's nice to be here with old friends. By the way, in the background, you'll hear our 4th grade class getting taught. So we have our COVID small spaces here at the Cochran household. But yeah, Jen, thanks for that plug on that resource. I think I also saw in the chat that you posted the options and considerations document that the National Network had put together. And just a quick shout out to a bunch of the National Network participants who I see on the call, folks like Mark Kaiser and Beth McGee and Jessica Fox and my colleagues at Willamette Partnership, Christiana Teague Witherall. That document was put together because all of us for more than a decade were working on building water quality trading programs, and 80% of our conversations were the same, whether we were in Oregon or Illinois or Florida. And so we put that document together so as you had conversations around baseline or banking or all the different technical aspects of trading, we could give you all the options. And we're not going to tell you which one on baseline is the best one. But we ought to tell you, if you choose option A, farmers will hate you forever. If you choose option B, environmental folks will sue you. If you do C, and then examples for who did what on each of those. So that document is there. I think, Anna, following your lead a little bit, I want to pop back out a little bit to the watershed level, because I think there's some more fundamental policy issues that the United States has failed to deal with in the last 30, 40 some years of water policy. Like if you just look at the status of water infrastructure, the last time we made a major investment in water infrastructure was when Phil Knight was making Nike shoes and a waffle iron. It's just been a long time. We're just coming to the useful life of a lot of that work. And when the Clean Water Act was passed, it was nasty visible problems of untreated wastewater, sewage going into rivers, and a technology approach really did do an enormous job of making progress there. But as we're looking at the broader watershed challenges that we're facing, there's a much different culture and policy approach that we're going to need to really make progress, not just on water quality, but looking at resilience to flooding, preparing for drought, all the different issues that are so interconnected, and not just interconnected with each other in the natural system, but also connected with what our vision for the future of an equitable economy is going to look like, what our future vision for how we're going to thrive and be healthy. So for example, here in Oregon, we're starting to take kind of a statewide broader look about how we modernize our approach to manage water. So trading is just a tool, that's all it is. But the power of the tool that we see is it allows you to quantify the values of good work that's happening on the land that other people understand how to invest in, and use that as a tool to move money from dumb stuff to better stuff. So rather than spending $16 million on a wastewater treatment plant that you know is not going to reduce temperature in a measurable way in a river in Southern Oregon, you have folks like Freshwater Trust partnering with municipalities to restore miles of stream. And those miles of stream that they've restored not only are having salmon and colder temperatures, but this fall when fires broke out in Southern Oregon, those riparian areas acted as fire breaks, preventing the speed of the spread of fire and preventing fire from moving up into structures. So we have kind of really specific benefits that are being created off of some of these programs, and whether you use them in a regulatory compliance context like trading, or whether you're just using them to articulate value relative to settling tribal treaty rights around water, whether you're looking at creating economic development opportunities for a Microsoft to create a new data center and create different jobs, or whether you're just dealing with a rural utility that's looking at a $20 million plant upgrade because their inflow to their sewer plant doubles during irrigation season because their pipes are so leaky. So I think my hope for looking at trading is we take a step back and say, how can we actually use this to change the culture of how we deal with water infrastructure? That water infrastructure is not just a techno-rational exercise. There's a way that we can democratize approaches. So for example, we're doing a lot of work on the healthcare side. When you took Medicaid dollars and put $20 million a year in the hands of community, you immediately went from more clinical solutions to building new transportation routes, building new parks, building new sidewalks, creating new radio shows to engage community. And so what does that start to look like when you take decisions out of the hands of regulators, engineers, and environmental organizations and put them back into the hands of community? And I think there's some ways to do that, particularly looking at some of the economic development approaches. So like a lot of our rural wastewater infrastructure is funded by rural development, the utility service, or economic development administration. So my hope would be that we actually look at our economic development dollars and start thinking about nature-based solutions, watershed-based solutions there, and look at programs like 319 or SRF to really figure out not just how we make the most cost-effective progress towards an overall water quality goal, but actually achieve the water quality goals, that vision of fishable, swimmable waters. So I think there's some conversations there. I think we just found we were looking at all of the federal loan and grant programs that fund water in some way, and there's over 300. different federal programs that touch water. I learned about agencies I didn't know existed. And so figuring out how to connect some of those things. So I really appreciate the water sub-cabinet concept. I think the other piece, Tim, you mentioned environmental justice and water justice. About 12% of American households can't afford water right now, that they're paying more than 5% of their household income on wastewater and drinking water. And in the last 10 years, what we pay for water has increased by 40%. And the federal share of investment in water infrastructure has dropped to where it was around 40, 60%, down to less than 10%. And that federal share is nowhere near what it is for transportation or aviation or other forms of infrastructure. So I think we've got to deal with that. And then looking at the added complexity of climate change, where we're going to have different patterns of temperature and precipitation. So I think all of that points, for me, a little less concern about scale. I think there's a couple of pieces. One, I think communities need some technical assistance, particularly around creating a new vision for what service level they're going to be providing around water. They haven't had the freedom to choose what their service levels are since 1977. And so what does that future look like, and how can you provide technical assistance for a new vision? I do think the feds need to set an expectation that I don't mind so much how you get there, but you need to reduce nutrient loads by 40% by this year. I think there just has to be that kind of expectation that the states back up. And then I think the other pieces of liability and risk, George, that you mentioned are also super important. And that's not just who's liable for regulatory compliance, but just how legal structures work and how litigation is functioning. I mean, here in the Willamette, we had a TMDL in 2004 for temperature. We were all set for over 1,600 miles of river restoration, and litigation after litigation after litigation after litigation has it so finally two utilities are voluntarily moving forward because they know it's right. But not everybody is. And so I think unwinding how we're implementing the Clean Water Act so that we get closer to a more just community vision is important. So I'll stop there so we can have a chance to chat a little bit.
Awesome, thank you, Bobby. I'm really struggling to winnow down my list of questions for you all into something we can do in the next half hour. But so I will turn it over without any further ado to George to quickly respond, and then we can get rolling on a good conversation.
I just want to let you all know I'm ready to go to Bob Cratchit's house for Christmas. So it's fantastic. A couple big points. And one thing is, I sit on the EPA Financial Advisory Board. And one of the charges we recently had is for stormwater trading. And we're reforming that. But I think it's a great opportunity for the audience and others to participate and to give insights. And I think this community-based environmental justice dynamic that Bobby and Tim have kind of raised are important issues. But I think as Tim mentioned, you integrate those issues into the equation. It may not be the low-cost dynamic, and people have to recognize that. And I think we wrestle that. Tim and I are on the Clean Water Commerce Act work group, and one of the things they want to do is buy pounds of nitrogen for the lowest cost, but then they also want an environmental justice component. And that if they allocate a certain percentage to environmental justice, they may not be buying the most cost effective. So the point here is the community determines their goals. And I think, Bobby, your point about, the bottom up, and Anna raised it, from her perspective, that if those goals include a significant environmental justice component, they have to recognize it may not be purely a cost dynamic. And I think it's important in the market context we recognize that. The other point is we all agree, that a watershed approach is right. And again, the community can define that. One of the things I do want to raise is, though, in the context of like an Ohio River, a Mississippi River, we've already seen in the Chesapeake Bay, you could create, like in Chesapeake Bay, the overlay idea, meaning there's a broader watershed initiative where crediting and tools of trading and market-based approaches are oriented towards the broader approach, but you still have local dynamics in play. If they're locally impaired waters, you still can enforce those issues. So that this blend of a broader overlay with a narrow overlay in the watershed context is, to me, intriguing, and one that we ought to be looking at in more places, particularly like Mississippi. One other point, and I'll leave it at this because I know we've got a lot of questions, is this point of finance and procurement. And as I mentioned earlier, a big part of the dynamic that we have in the market scenario is a fairly limited demand. And demand can be either through a regulatory driver, i.e. a permit, or it could be, as Tim mentioned, it's a funding source, and you're procuring dollars from the state or counties to go buy these products that they may have an obligation under their permit regime. And we've seen great success in basically adopting the performance-based approach. But again, you can't do that unless you have a metric and a conversion factor. But just to give you a flavor, in one county in Maryland, we saw 60% savings through performance-based contracting. And you say, well, how's that done with the private sector? And you're saying it can be done with the private sector because the private sector is optimizing the solution, is looking at scalability in the context of the delivery of that product, so that they are looking at that approach to optimize the best cost per unit. But again, if you don't have unit defined, you don't have the practices or the lifespan and the specs of those practices, then there's no way you can leverage that. And as Tim kind of mentioned, I think this final point is this leveraging of the public-private domain. We can't do this alone publicly. There is so much finance available, so many great opportunities for operators to participate, to advance this initiative. I think Anna and her team recognize that and was leading in that direction, but we need to get away from this notion of private sector bad in the environmental context. Private sectors are partners, and we've shown that in the mitigation context for over 20 some years. I'll leave it at that.
Awesome, thank you, George. So I think, well, first, do any of the panelists have questions for each other? Speak now. All right. I'm going to start with Anna. So you mentioned the executive order in this October, and how it gave set up this new permanent sort of water sub-cabinet, and it gave them 150 days to identify priorities and recommendations for cross-agency integrated infrastructure planning. And I think in light of some of the points that Bobby has made about, we're doing things the way that we have for decades, and I'd be really curious to hear, what kinds of cross-agency coordination you would be most excited about and would help you better deliver on your own priorities at EPA. And then as a sort of a follow-on question, Alex Eccles had mentioned specifically a mismatch between USDA conservation management actions and EPA benchmarks, and if there was scope to bring those into better alignment, so that ag actions are appropriately credited in EPA's models.
Thanks for the question. Your first question about what kind of cross-agency coordination would I like to see? I think some points that were raised both by Tim and Bobby were great ones. I think it was Bobby who discovered agencies that he had never heard of in looking at federal financing opportunities. But I think that there's a lot there. I really do. When we talk about integrated planning, we've been talking about integrated planning at EPA in the narrow sort of water infrastructure. How do communities prioritize their limited resources with this range of regulatory programs and demands that they must meet for their community and for their governments. But I think it'd be just a phenomenal transformation if we could broaden that integrated planning thinking beyond that narrow scope that we've talked about at the EPA. And we can think about it in the context of start with flooding, start with disaster relief concepts. I know that agriculture was just hammered with flooding a couple of years ago throughout the Mississippi River Basin up in the Midwest. And those flood events cause water quality concerns as well, and community impact concerns, and economic concerns, and soil health concerns. And so the more, and infrastructure, you know, across the board. So the more we can have these agencies, you know, we start with this executive order with these portions of these agencies that have water equities, resources to put toward these. But as a federal government, if we could begin to integrate those multiple overlapping critical programs, and just think about the resource more holistically. We've got a limited amount of money. We always do. That's always a problem. And we have unending needs. And how do we better address the range of needs around water with those limited resources? So again, you know, in a perfect world, and let's use market-based approaches as an example, like setting aside the integrated planning across the federal government, using these market-based approaches to address flood and climate infrastructure issues, soil health and nutrients and temperature. We can get to multiple components of that larger problem if we have a more holistic market-based view of the problem to solve and how to solve it. So in a perfect world, we get credit stacking. We put the baggage in the closet or in the basement where it belongs, and we begin to look at these really important multiple credit driving opportunities to address these important community concerns. Alec, hello, nice to hear from you. This is a question that I think that he's been asking for at least since I've been here at EPA. How to better align, you know, what EPA will view as a credit or benefit with what USDA does. It's a hard question, and I think it can be solved with getting the agencies together on models that they agree with. You know, the USDA has this NTT, this nutrient tracking tool that's field-based, that evaluates the benefits from certain best management practices, and a few states have had that tool calibrated to their state soil profile, topography, etc. Can be a great tool, and I've been very vocal and it's in supportive of it from EPA standpoint. But we also need to figure out a way to integrate watershed-based modeling with that field scale modeling so that we get the whole view. That to me also is sort of the golden ring if you get both of those components in a single model, calibrated locally. But, you know, it's not a great answer for Alec there, and the question that he continues to ask, it's an important one. But again, the more we can just coordinate across agencies and try to come to common understanding, we have the same goals. We have different tools to get there. We have different internal metrics for even evaluating whether we're succeeding in our goals. Start to align some of those better, and see where that gets us as a place to start.
Thanks, Anna. And Bobby, I think you had a reaction.
Oh, I just wanted to double down on your concept, Anna, of the integrated plans. I think that tool is one that has an enormous amount of potential with a couple tweaks. I think the integrated plans as they're now kind of are tied to consent decrees or some connection that you're out of compliance, and then you set priorities. I think if there's a way to kind of be thinking about the use of integrated plans more broadly so that they become a solution for multiple regulatory pieces like you were hinting at, I think would be great. And I think there's also ways to look at kind of, as we think about guidelines for what goes into an integrated plan. I think there was a question about community benefits. Like if you look at community health needs assessments on the health side of things, the federal government did set expectations for what needed to be in community health needs assessment, and that required community engagement and input. So I think there's some ways to think about those integrated plans that you could also tie incentives to, like the USDA's RCPP program or 319 program ties to implementing an integrated plan. So I like that.
Great. All right, I've got a question that I'm going to open up to everybody, so feel free to sort of jump in as the mood takes you. We've got a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to mash together a little bit, but as we sort of look out across the U.S. and at sort of the whole universe of different approaches that we're seeing being tried, and some of them are working, where are the new opportunities, right? Like what's the next generation that you see that you are really excited about, or sort of the next region where you think trading could really take off? And then the second part of that question is, and this is from Evan Bernosky, asked, how can EPA, at the federal level, help to sort of spread these examples of programs that are working, or even just pieces of programs, right? Because I think we're seeing that there's sort of this modular way we ought to be thinking about this. And he mentioned, could EPA revise the handbook for permit writers to provide more case studies to states or communities? And so second part of the question is, number one, where are the new opportunities, and number two, how do we communicate better about those opportunities and what's working?
I'm gonna jump in with my first answer to the second question, and that is that since I've been in this seat, I've tried to develop a website to showcase some case studies of successful programs. I think I've gotten maybe 5, maybe 6 written up and posted to the website. They should be on our trading website, but it's a huge missed opportunity if we can't continue to develop those, because one of the biggest roles that EPA really has here is one of a convener and a sharer of information. We are a regulator. We're always going to be that. But for these market-based approaches, we're not really running the programs. We can provide technical advice, but they're state-run programs or tribal-run programs or regional programs. And so the best that we can do is to provide information, and hopefully folks will pick up the pieces that work for them and leave behind the pieces that don't. So I've been very focused on that for a long time, with somewhat limited success, I guess. In part, it's trying to prioritize a short write-up over the 7,000 other things on everyone's to-do list internally, and that's just our fault for not doing better. But I think that there have been other efforts at this, at developing case studies for successful programs. And one of the things that I wanted to really focus on in developing ours, I'm not sure how well it came through, but I love the idea of the different components, how they're different, why they're different, and just setting those out for folks to see. The different way that, for example, Iowa has been financing some of their constructed wetland programs compared to how the state of Florida has done some similar work, but really with different financing structures and investments from public and private, just structured differently. So putting that out there for folks to see that they can be done differently with similar outcomes is really important. I've tried to do that. Wish I had more time. I would do more of them. So go ahead, Tim, I'll stop.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I think I love actions like that, Anna, like documents and communication about it. You know, I would give it, the example I'd give is the National Academy of Sciences, led by a guy named Paul Barton, Professor Paul Barton, who was my hydrology professor, just did a big review of the Catskills program on a watershed approach to creating drinking water quality in New York City's reservoirs. And like reviews before it, the National Academy has found that the program was enormously successful, right? So that's an example of something you could try to get a congressional subcommittee to do a hearing with that as the centerpiece, and then talk about the success of these approaches. Bring somebody from Iowa, to that same hearing in an ag committee or in an environment committee. White House roundtable is another great way to elevate work, and an EPA's regional and national meetings, or USDA, or FEMA, where you're just giving airtime to the people who are working on these programs. Means that if other people want to get airtime, if people want, their 15 seconds in the spotlight, they have to have something similar to talk about. So that kind of communication can be really valuable. I absolutely think that guidance documents are really helpful as well, and manuals and updates to manuals to give people more of a some more recipes basically on how to build these programs. But I think those sort of softer actions, communication efforts, can be huge. And then just on the region, I'm just going to give a shout out to the Chesapeake Bay region again. I think Chesapeake Bay region is far ahead already on creativity, and it's going to keep leaving the rest of the country behind when it comes to programs that are happening across in each of the states and then across the region. Abilities to use currencies and models to count what's going on. So happens to be in my home region, so I'm just I've got a little local pride, but I just am really interested and excited by the stuff that I see going on. And I think just one of the most important programs for me in the Chesapeake Bay, because it gets at this issue that, and Sanjeev raised this in a question beforehand, is, why haven't trading programs done it all, right? And I think initially there was an overpromise around trading that it would, solve the whole problem. Virginia's built a program, George mentioned it in passing, that's an offset program that deals with new development for very, very small impacts to water quality, right? The like death by 1,000 cut stuff that we complain about not ever being regulated. Virginia's built a program that has nutrient bank offsets that operates so efficiently that the developers are not seemingly minding paying $12 to $15 million for offsets that are delivering real conservation value in Virginia for impacts that generally aren't being captured or regulated at all in almost any other state. So it's an example of a very small program that probably will always be small, but is getting at this niche that nobody else is really solving. So I'll just leave it at that, and just Chesapeake Bay.
I'll jump in on that, and I think Tim, let's talk about Virginia, and I think North Carolina is another good example. And to me, they're Sanjeev, to answer some of your questions, they're the most robust market scenarios. There are a lot of other programs that are contrived markets, but really are just state flexibility and spending. But the issue that you get at is why. And I think one of the things that I always look at, and it goes back to all of our panelists' points, which is simplicity. Virginia, for example, has a lookup table to determine what practices are eligible and what kind of crediting you could get depending on where you're located. And then also they're very clear on the baseline. So going into it, whether you're meeting the baseline, what kind of crediting you could get as a credit provider, and how does that meet into the marketplace. The other thing is they allow de facto banking. They have nutrient offset banks that literally are recognized for a 30-year period. So when a developer buys, they're buying once. And that's that. The transaction isn't some annual approach. It isn't a seasonal market approach. It doesn't have all these complications associated with it. But then the second point, Jen, to answer your question on where next, the couple things I raise, rather than looking at a particular area, I think the key factors in a market are what are the drivers, is there funding, and is there programmatic simplicity in the development of the opportunity. And when you think about that, I look at it as on a sector basis, where we're seeing stormwater really evolve, and it comes out of the Chesapeake Bay experiment as an example of market-based solutions, not per se trading, but performance-based solutions using stormwater. Why? Because there's funding through the municipal tax base. And I'll give you an example, and where I don't think it's really working is Iowa. To be frank, they've had a nutrient reduction strategy for over 5-6 years. We've got an outcome-based fund that Tim has mentioned, but that's done through Cargill money. It's very incremental. The issues are major. And the issue is that 89% of the regulated enterprise are farmers. 11% are municipalities. And farmers are not regulated per se, and therefore it's not a great regulatory framework for having a market that's going to work with funding and driving. So I think stormwater, I also think from a regional perspective, we can translate what's going on in the Bay. Tim, very proud of what's going on there as well. But I think we need to translate, and I think West Coast is translating on some stormwater sectors, and also the Midwest is taking a hard look at this stuff, particularly in municipalities.
I'm gonna jump in there because I think there's some folks that are registered that would disagree with the work that's going on in Iowa. I was actually going to say, the work that we've done in the Office of Water as co-chairs of the Hypoxia Task Force, Iowa being the other co-chair currently, we've really tried to energize that task force to be really much more action oriented. And I think we've done a lot in the last couple of years to really energize the meetings, the discussions. We've built new work groups around state priority issues. And I think that there's been some interest by those states in pursuing market-based approaches. Now, some of those states have long been pursuing them. Wisconsin is a great example. Iowa is another great example more recently, but states throughout the watershed, we've been presenting them with information, and external folks have been presenting to the task force states, and they've got their goals. They're not regulatory drivers necessarily, but they are state driven and this sort of watershed community driven goals that they have committed to. And so whether it's a trading or some other performance based approach, I think there's a ton of opportunity there, and I want to be a cheerleader for them, because they've got a long road ahead. It's a huge swath of land that's maybe the majority of the continental United States. That's part of the contributions to the Gulf. But I think there's a ton of opportunity, and momentum is important. Energy and momentum and interests are all important. So that's my shout out to the Midwest and the Mississippi River Basin.
And I don't want to denigrate Iowa at all. And I, look, the Iowa soybean group and others have been great leaders in trying to advance this. I just say it's a good example of a scenario when you're looking at it more on a transactional market-based dynamic. A good example where, frankly, you need a hammer. In my mind. Meaning we've had a lot of voluntary discussions for over 10 years in Iowa. There's been a lot of great momentum. There's great people that want to do great things. But what we have left is we're left to the will of a Cargill to go voluntary, put philanthropy money in an outcome-based fund in a very limited way. And so I guess that's my main point. But I don't want to denigrate the work of a lot of the good folks in Iowa. So leave it at that.
Does anybody want to respond to what George just said? I mean, I think that we've been focused a little bit more on sort of the market design pieces, and I'm kind of hearing, you know, a consensus that we know how to do this. There are a lot of different ways to do this, and it's going to depend on every community in terms of how you structure it and your crediting and, you know, baselines. But this question of demand, right? That feels like a nut that hasn't been cracked in quite a lot of places. And as George just pointed out, you know, one ingredient there is the stick, right? But I wonder if any of the other panelists could talk a little bit about how we drive demand, how we drive more dollars, you know, and whether that's actions at federal, state, local levels. You know, what have you seen that has worked, or what needs to become unstuck?
I'll take a stab at it.
Yeah.
Sort of high level, my view of the world on it. You know, we hear a lot about the need for the regulatory drivers, and one of the easiest things to look to is a numeric criteria for temperature or for nutrients. And one of the things that I've learned from being in this seat is that almost every state in the country has narrative water quality standards that they translate into numeric limits. And so I think I'm not condoning or supporting this approach. I do think that like rulemaking and, you know, a public transparent process for establishing numeric criteria is probably a good way to go too. But you know, all of the states have narrative standards, and they all have an opportunity to establish numeric criteria in permits. Whether they do or not, that's a state sort of driven decision. One of the things that I've just recently been talking about internally is how can we promote better focus of these priority areas in our oversight role at EPA, because we have oversight role for the state programs that develop these permits, and so one of the things, and I just had a conversation this morning about it. We have these PQRs, they're like checklists that we go through when we're evaluating state permit programs. When we pull several permits to do oversight, we could do a better job of dropping priority issues into those checklists. Have you considered incorporating X criteria or X type of criteria into the permit? You know, have you considered the ability or the availability of market-based approaches to supplement or support? And flip side to that, are you precluding the use of those tools within your permits or in your program, whether it's intentional or unintentional? So I think we can do a better job of sort of building some of that in to the work that we do with state permit programs. And I think, again, that's where those decisions are made. I would argue that states have all the tools they need to develop those hammers if they wanted them. And, you know, we provide technical support and the ability to, drive those forward, but it's got to come from the state tribal regulators.
Yeah, I would just add, I think a lot about the examples I use are ants versus architects, right? So ants don't have handbooks. They don't have long meetings where they write large community plans that explain exactly where they're going to go look for food. It somehow just works, right? They have a very simple set of rules. Whereas architects or engineers build everything out, everything is designed. And I think in this space, we've focused a little too much on the prescriptive, detailed plan approach, and a little less on the simple rules approach. And to me, what I mean by a simple rule is not rule with a capital R from a regulatory perspective, but like these ideas of currencies, right? If you just recognize, and let me use a simple one that's got some, some flaws to it, but cover crops. If you just say cover crops are worth this much in our state. And I agree with Anna that a lot of this should happen at the state level. Cover crops are going to be worth this much. Anyone who wants to pay for cover crop practices, or let's talk about a permanent practice like tree planting in riparian areas. You want to pay for those things. This is what the credit value equals. You will see a lot more use of those kinds of activities in programs without a lot of additional prescription, right? Because they make sense and they have enormous additional co-benefits and are happening, in other ways. So I think, and to me in the, in the Iowa context, or actually Illinois, I'm going to pick on Illinois for a second because we've been trying to get stuff going there. There's an effort to build out, watershed-based plans that describe, where you're going to put practices, what kind of practices you put in those places. Basically an optimization model, right? The kind of stuff that scientists like to do. I don't think that's needed. I think you just need a currency and a regulatory acceptance of the value of those outputs, model that translates it all for everyone. If you have those ingredients, you can either, structure that in how much of your permit requirement are you going to get through these activities, or you can just let regulated entities do it themselves, figure out how much is going to be from that versus a wastewater plant upgrade. So I just think the currencies piece is really this, like, the holy grail in the space, and we've made enormous progress in that area. American Farmland Trust just did a great review of all the models that exist and their strengths and weaknesses, and utility to everybody from farmers to state regulators. I think that's where a lot of the progress is going to happen in the next 5 years, on a small scale like the Virginia program, small harms, and on a bigger scale as well.
And Tim, just kind of building on your analogy around ants, part of why that's simple and it works is there's a culture. And I think I don't want us to lose the need to really change our culture around water. Because I know, like, the youth in my neighborhood, if they came through a community college program to become wastewater operators and didn't get nature-based solutions and farm-based solutions trained out of them, they would naturally see that as a clear option. So really thinking upstream on workforce development, community college programs, really thinking around organizing. I don't know that we need more handbooks. Talking with the Rural Water Association, they've got circuit riders that are going around and doing most of the design work for rural wastewater right now. We've got economic development districts in every part of the country that are putting together strategies around infrastructure. So really thinking through the technical assistance capacity, how do we actually organize to change culture around water and water solutions, I think is a big piece of what we need to be thinking about too.
Yeah, Bobby, I think that's a wonderful thought as we're closing. I see that we're at the top of the hour and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but Jessica Fox also just had a great comment in the chat noting that what we're talking about is probably bigger than just finding the most cost-effective and the most efficient way to mitigate pollution, right? There's a lot of other sort of, we've been talking about justice, we've been talking about supporting agricultural communities. I mean, there's sort of this bigger set of issues and being thoughtful about how much of that we put on the back of trading, as Jessica points out, and what is a larger cultural change, which I think, we're hearing from Anna that, is happening. And so I don't know if anyone's got any closing thoughts before we go. Yeah.
I would just say one thing, and I would maybe reframe Jessica's comment, because I don't think that we want to put all these responsibilities on the back of a trading program or a market-based program, but rather if we look at these problems through that lens, or through a series of these market-based approaches, lenses, with the integrated planning concepts that we talked about, I think we'll start to see those problems more clearly and have more creative thought as to how we can address some of them in a bundle instead of in a siloed approach like we've done for decades to reach where we are today, which is we've still got a lot to do. And so it's not necessarily piling on to this concept, how much can we expect a market to do, but rather where can we create those opportunities for markets to bring improvements and benefits to our communities holistically.
Jen, I would just quickly weigh in and say, the market will respond if there are community goals, environmental justice goals, and water quality goals. It can respond if there's clear directions and commitments. And I think that's part of the issue. It can't be wishy-washy. And the example I'm working on a project with Forest Trends in Peru, where we're dealing with water-based enhancement plus gender workforce development. Both of those can be integrated into the ultimate solutions, and markets will respond, but you need the clear direction and the goals. And without that, I think that's, going back to Tim's part about metrics, it being well defined, I think that's a key.
Great. Well, maybe we can call this a victory. I want to thank all of the panelists for turning up, and especially Tim for sort of spearheading this. I think that this has come together really quickly, and it's been a wonderful conversation. I wish we could continue it all day. I'll follow up with a recording and a record of all these resources folks are sharing, and I hope to see you all sometime soon in person.
Thanks, Jen. It's been really fun.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Great panel.
Cheers.